All right, thank you guys so much for joining me for another live stream. We the Governed Ask Me Anything live stream. As I kind of attempted to promote a little bit in my thumbnail and kind of promotion of the live stream for tonight, I was going to start getting into some of the ways the Trump administration will have a direct impact in Washington State, and perhaps it might be worthwhile just to discuss some of the places where you could easily find or start to uncover some of the fraud that's going on in the state, at least that would be appropriate for the Justice Department starting maybe next January to actually come in and investigate here. Because obviously Bob Ferguson's not going to investigate any fraud on himself, and he spent most of a career covering up whatever he did find. So it'd be interesting to see. I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have and discuss. Just as a kind of a quick overview for tonight's live stream. Basically, it isn't Ask Me Anything. I do, as you ask me questions, I'm basically going to, when I'm trying to do my best to answer those questions, they're going to look like this down here. And then I'm going to be doing my best to actually answer that question, so you'll know, even though maybe I go astray from the original content of the question, that's going to be an easy way for you to see what the question I'm trying to answer. When you do ask me a question, if you can just put @We the Govern into it in some way so that I can see it. Sometimes the comment section gets filled up where there's a lot of people talking back and forth, which is fine, and I encourage that. It's just that when I'm trying to find questions, I'm trying to pick out those questions there. And I'm also going to try to do a better job jumping so that I'm not asking only from one person a bunch of questions. And people have complained about that in the past. Do my best to solve it right now. So that's kind of my plan here. Just another quick overview as I'm kind of in the studio here today. I did, if I saw you up in Kenmore and I was doing a presentation up there, just thanks for going to that event. That was the, I think, North King County Women's Republican Club. Just thank you so much for having me coming up there and get a chance to talk to you. If you heard me on KGMI up in Whatcom County last Saturday morning, I was talking to Charlie Crabtree, just going over a couple of the issues related to how the Trump administration can actually impact Washington State, and that was a lively conversation. And if you are out in Spokane Thursday night, go to the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights on their website. I know I'm going to be going out there doing a presentation to them at that time, and probably a meeting with a couple different groups of activists while I'm out there in the eastern side of the state. As always, it seems like there's more things that I need to get to than I actually have the time to do so. But I'm going to do my best while I'm out there to get on top of a couple of whistleblowers. You know who you are. I'm going to be talking to you about what you think you have and what we can find and possibly publicize. And then I'll be making my way back to the wet side of the state here. Now, tonight, if you are in Southwest Washington, supposedly there's the bomb cyclone coming by tonight. So if for some reason we lose power right in the middle of this in this show, it's okay. My presumption is that it just means that the creaky power grid that Washington State has just went down a little bit with a little bit of wind, if that actually happens. But for everybody else out there, be safe and just be careful and watch those trees. That's usually the biggest risk that we have during a windstorm like this. So another real quick comment that I wanted to make, I put up a video I think it was Saturday that it actually was launched. I filmed it last week, shortly. In fact, yesterday when I was last week when I was doing the live stream, so a week ago, the live stream, I just filmed that video about what the Trump administration can actually do as far as an impact on Washington State. And that seems to have resonated quite a bit with people who live here, or at least people have shared that video around a lot. I mean, my channel, I'm pretty happy with generally the views I'm able to get on a channel that's been shadow banned as much as mine has. And that video seems to have somehow broken through some of those restrictions and has gotten out there a lot more. The funny thing is I can never really predict which of these videos people seem to like more than others. But I want to thank you for sharing the video around. I think it gets the word out there to a little bit wider audience than where it was before, and it's always better, I think, if we're sharing some of this information around. There are so many things, I think, that are going to be changing and impacting our state. More than most people realize, with the Trump administration coming into office in January, with a decent majority in the Senate, and slim majority in the House, it seems likely that they can't change everything about what could be a big impact in Washington State. But I suspect that the handful of issues that I've discussed at length, and I'm happy to discuss them more even tonight, especially when it comes to election reform, federal election reform, will be very impactful. I did 2 videos today that will roll out over the next couple days. One of them is about the election reform policies that our state could implement that would be, I think, a fairly big deal and substantially change, not just in Washington, but especially Oregon, Washington, California, Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona. Most significantly, those reforms would actually probably change substantially the way that elections are being conducted in our states. I care the most about Washington because that's where I live, but the truth is any kind of federal reform is going to have wider spread impacts than just our state. But the impact it would have here is pretty dramatic. So I did a video about that, walking through the 6 policy reforms that are most likely to be implemented, and then the impact that those would probably have on our state. Interestingly enough, one of the reforms that is in that list is actually a no more machines, in the sense of no more electronic voting, that you need to have a paper trail. That's going to affect us the least in the state because we already have paper trails. Now, if part of the reform requires them to make it a little bit easier to audit, that would be a beneficial impact. But because right now the auditors and the Secretary of State do everything they can to prevent us from doing any kind of an audit or physical review of the ballots. Up until 2015, that used to be possible, but with some of the lawsuits that they'd had at that time with the Green Party guys that were suing over it, they've really, the decisions of the Supreme Court, let's just say the way they've interpreted those decisions has been such that it actually reduces our ability to go in and do any kind of practical audits on election results anymore, which for the previous 150 years was pretty normal. People would go back and do that anywhere in the country. And it's not normal, and it usually is an indication of a problem if you are restricting people from being able to go in and effectively audit results or outcomes of elections. If you remember back in 2000 during the Hanging Chad fiasco with the Bush election, Bush v. Gore, that was centered on Florida, after that election was done, the news media was actually given access to vast troves of ballots for them to go back and look at and review some of these election results, which they spent a massive amount of resources and I believe almost a year digging through it all to see if Bush didn't actually win that election, and only to come to the conclusion that it looked like he did. But nevertheless, at least to their credit, they spent the time to dig through it all. And they had the ability to do so. In Washington State, you'd never be allowed to do that. And that's an issue, and I think it needs to be corrected. But that wasn't the main focus. I simply walked through the 6 policy reforms that were likely to be implemented. That video should be up in a couple days. The other video I did was about how Donald Trump could shut down Evergreen State College. I just wanted to walk through that scenario so people were more familiar with it. And I'm happy to talk about any of these topics today, even though I did a video on them, and they're going to launch in the near future. I'm presuming the people who log into the live stream like this, you're the diehards, and you actually are really probably the more wonkish ones, really interested in some of these details. So happy to go over anything that I've already covered in a video, even if you haven't seen it yet. And it might be a little repetitive when it comes out. That's okay. It's these are the discussions and kind of the wonkishness that I like to have when we're talking about some of the policy issues and changes that Washington State faces. We're kind of in this weird environment, and I don't know how many other people notice this, but Ferguson really, Bob Ferguson, after the new governor coming in, usually you'd have kind of this window of time that there would be some kind of a, positive views for Washington or something like that. And he completely, it's so not in his character to be a normal person that he jumps right into this Trump derangement syndrome, which is apparently his happy place. And he goes into this weird standing on the courthouse door and schoolhouse door and preventing anybody from changing anything in Washington State. I mean, it's just a really weird dynamic. Something about the nature of a Democrat who's gotten in that position, I don't know, but it's just odd. And I think that that issue. The weird approach that he's structuring the state for. I'm thankful for his bizarre behavior because it will draw more attention to Washington State by the Trump administration, and I think all the attention we can get from them is going to be helpful because any federal policy fixes that are implemented that would affect us here are going to affect probably a number of other states as well, and they're going to be needed. As they downsize, if they actually get to this, I sure hope they do, if they're actually downsizing some of these federal agencies and making them go away, there's benefit to all of us, and there's definitely a discussion about how that impacts federalism, distribution of federal funds to states, withholding, especially of grant grifting, tax distribution situations. There's a lot of neat things that can happen out of this that generally have positive outcomes. So I'm happy to go into any of these subjects if you want. Let's get to some of these questions right now. I can see them starting to grow here a little bit, and let's just get into a few of them right now. And the first one here actually is this question right here: will he take our guns? And I'm assuming you're talking about Bob Ferguson. There's something, and I need to go back and look at, I think the Washington Gun Rights or Gun Law channel has probably done a pretty good couple series of videos about this, and I really like the content that they produce over there. I don't see it every day, I don't see it all the time, but I like what they've done on their content. So to some extent, if people really want to get into the most detailed level you can about Second Amendment issues, then I'd refer you to the Washington Gun Law channel, because I think they've done a really good job covering some of these topics. However, Bob Ferguson is in an interesting situation right now, because essentially he's opened himself up already to a substantial number of Department of Justice investigations that are probably going to go on in our state. And when I say that, essentially, I think assuming the Trump administration, this is always a big caveat, right? So people say they're going to do something. We'll see if they really do. But I'll give them the benefit of the doubt at this point in time until they demonstrate that they're not serious about some of these issues. So I'm assuming that they are. And let's just say they appoint some genuinely aggressive federal attorneys in the Seattle and the Spokane district, the eastern and western districts of Washington state. And there's some desire to actually fix issues in Washington or address them here, and that they aren't going to be filled by a placeholder who's just sitting there trying to pad his resume and doesn't plan to fight. That certainly won't fit the profile of what I think the Trump administration is looking for right now. Nevertheless, guys come in there and they're willing to fight, and they care about actually getting to the bottom of what's going on in Washington state. There's two basic categories of actions that the federal government can take through the Department of Justice, in which they're legally, they're playing in their sandbox, but they're addressing issues here. One is just flat-out investigations of fraud, public integrity cases and investigations in our state. We know that Bob Ferguson's never, they've ignored every case that gets brought to their attention. Again, there's small examples where somebody's exceptionally dumb. The gal out of Tacoma that set the new state record for theft of public funds when she stole $12.7 million from that low-income housing project. But usually these are just the dumb people that get caught, and they don't have any political cover. You know, they just decided that the system's bad, and it is, so they decide to grab theirs and hopefully get away with it, and they were one of the unlucky few that get caught. Most people probably get away with that theft. And so she gets caught, and of course they're going to prosecute her because you can't hide it anymore. But outside of some of those cases, generally, if it's a politically protected class of theft, then you're going to see that law enforcement generally has been stymied or not been allowed to really look at it. It doesn't matter what evidence or whistleblowers come forward. And if it's theft of funds that either involve direct transfers of federal funds, or if it's a theft of funds or that are above a certain threshold, technically in federal law it's $5,000, but they don't usually want to do nickel and dime cases, so they would probably look at bigger thresholds, theft of money for the most part, before they'd actually do a federal prosecution. But as they start to dig into that, and that's one thing. I mean, just digging the public integrity cases, of which there's tons. In fact, I'll talk about some of the places today where I would start looking if I was involved in the Department of Justice and I cared about these issues. I care about these issues, but I don't work for the government. And if I did, though, these are the areas I'd look into. And then the second thing is civil rights cases. There's a long history of the Department of Justice, especially going back in particular to the 1960s, although it started earlier under the Eisenhower administration in particular in the 1950s, where the Department of Justice was trying to restore civil rights that were being taken away by local government. It kind of started in the voting rights era in the 1950s when Eisenhower signed the 1957 Voting Rights Act or Civil Rights Act in an effort to try to address the fact that the bad voter rolls in the southern states run by Democrats didn't allow Republicans essentially to register to vote, and especially it didn't allow black Republicans to register to vote more specifically. But also, they've started to recognize that local government does sometimes take away our civil rights in a lot of other cases as well. In our state, where I believe our state is going to be most vulnerable, and this is caused in part by the decline and collapse of our state Supreme Court. Since they're unwilling to recognize that the Constitution exists or that it means what it says, then that failure to address some of these problems in our state has opened the state up for sure to civil rights litigation from the federal government, specifically on probably First Amendment rights in regards to the cases that were uncovered with Secretary of State with Hobbs' office, working with Bob Ferguson and the University of Washington, creating these censorship boards, trying to silence anybody like myself who actually had anything different to say than what the political elite want us to say. The other thing is Second Amendment rights, most clearly, in our state. This is a wide open opportunity to litigate and prevail on some of these gun rights issues here. Thirdly is going to be, I believe, takings cases, Fourth Amendment sort of cases at the federal level, Fourth Amendment cases that deal with abuse of property rights in our state, mostly with the Central Planning schemes under the Growth Management Act, but more specific implementations that probably involve the Department of Ecology and other opportunities. So if they really do care about civil rights prosecutions, those are probably the three categories I would most likely expect them to pursue. It's possible that there may be some racial discrimination litigation that you might be able to find in our state, probably a discrimination against Asians the way that the state has a disparate impact in destroying the education system here in a way that probably most disproportionately affects some minorities in the state, in a way, ethnic minorities, which are defined as protected classes in federal law. So those would be good examples of federal cases. But let's jump into your questions. I'm sorry I got off on a totally different subject after you asked them. I don't see Ferguson going too much further down this road. I think we're rapidly going to see a very, very different sort of situation. And he's decided to double down on dumb along with Jayapal and some of the other crazies. And it's great if they're going to do that. I think they just put a bigger and bigger target and draw more attention to themselves, which is probably what we want in this state at this point in time. Let's see. Jack Palder, there's a question. And I'm starting, guys, I'm going to try to hit the questions, and I'm going to try to keep bouncing through some of this. Jack Palder down here, your opinion on states and courts that thumb their noses at Supreme Court rulings. Do we need not follow laws we don't agree with? And I'm sure this comes out of the Pennsylvania case where it's a local jurisdiction there in the county that decided they would go and break election law and just count illegal votes, votes that the Supreme Court directed them not to count. And I think there will be consequences for that behavior on their part. Now, I know they're kind of backpedaling right now, but there is a place for states and feds to certainly have disputes and determination as to where states' rights are and where the federal government is. Now, historically, my argument has dominantly been that the government overreaches when it comes to its involvement in states' activities. But weirdly, when it comes to civil rights or our protection of our freedoms, First, Second, and Fourth Amendment cases in particular, the states in some cases, like Washington, like Oregon, like California, like Colorado and Illinois, they've decided that they want to abuse our civil rights more than the feds even have historically. And so they really do put a target on themselves and deserve a lot more attention to it. So I think there will be some consequences to that. Now, the great question you ask here, Jack, that's sort of related to it is that perhaps, this idea of sanctuary states is that they've gone down this kind of approach to creating sanctuary states and cities, and we don't need to follow immigration laws and all this other stuff. That is such a destructive path to some extent, because what you're doing is if one side does it, so can the other. Now, the history, of course, has been that the left only wants sanctuary status for their pet policies, and they deny elections or sanctuary status for yours. So when we had a number of sheriffs in Washington state and counties decide that they were going to be sanctuary states for Second Amendment rights, Then you had Bob Ferguson when he was Attorney General, rattling his sabers and pretending like he cared about making sure he came out and abused those states and attacked them. You had situations like Chris Reichdahl, who's the OSPI, Office Superintendent of Public Instruction, and he's done more than any other living human in modern times in Washington State to destroy the public education system and whatever credibility it might have left. And part of that self-destruction and self-immolation process on Chris Reichel's part was to basically threaten school districts just a couple of years after the McCleary decision, which he had argued for and pontificated about and said schools need a lot more money, got them all this extra money. COVID comes along, and suddenly Chris Reichel becomes the tyrant that nobody's ever seen in the public school system before. And if a school district said that they weren't going to require masks and they didn't want to abuse their school children and community with abusive and bizarre and strange, weird behavior that makes sense to Reichel and nobody else, Reichel threatened them to take away their funding, which is absolutely not even remotely possible for him to do it. And yet he did, and it was this constant threat. I was around several of the school districts that were dealing with that at the time, and I think there are consequences for some of this stuff, and I think that they're going to be you're going to see some of these consequences moving forward, and we'll see. Obviously, I know what the Trump administration's saying. I'm hoping that their promises and aspirations and what the transition team claims they're going to do, that they do stick with most of those. If they do stick with some percentage of them, then we have the opportunity to actually fix a lot of things that are broken in our state and elsewhere in this country. George Goff, when are we going to have an electoral college for states? State-run elections. Most of us are tired of King County and Snohomish. Yeah. So here's the thing: in order to do that, you would have to change the Washington State Constitution quite significantly, as it turns out. And so that is a steep lift. I can tell you, you are a long, long ways away from having enough votes to make that change. I'm also not sure, because in order to have a constitutional amendment change in our Constitution, you would have to have not just legislative approval, but you'd also have to have the voters approve it. And I am not sure that would pass in our state. It might come close. It all depends. I'd be curious to see how it would be structured. I like the idea. I went down this path back in 2011 when I was looking at reform potential, ideas that might be a little libertarian or kind of on the edge of policy discussions in an effort to try to extend that Overton window conversation about those types of wonkish policy conversations. This was actually something I remember looking at, but the hurdle to get over to get there is fairly high. Now, remember, as I mentioned earlier, there are some major things that could change in our state with federal election reform. And I deal with this again in the video coming up, but I think people have no idea the significance of what that electoral reform would bring to our state. It's not a utopian nirvana solution tomorrow for everything. And no matter what you do with election reform, there will always be opportunities for people to cheat and game the system. That's always existed. It's always happened. However, I think some of the problems that we've seen and found in our current system go away with the policy proposals they're making, and I think it'll have different outcomes. I don't know how much that outcome would openly and obviously affect statewide positions yet, but I can tell you that it would change the control of the state legislature in probably both houses, so that's kind of a big deal. But anyway, that's your answer there. It takes a constitutional amendment to make that change. Mike Brady, is it likely that the three initiatives that failed will be resurrected in 2026? Good question. I can guarantee without saying there's a guarantee that they probably will if there's you got two scenarios. They probably will if there's a change to the elections, like if there's a reform in the election process. But it might be a more staggered outcome. My belief, and I don't think I'm wrong on this, is that if they actually did make electoral reform and we could clean up some of the problems that exist in our current voting rolls, and mainly the voting rolls are the biggest change, then we would probably have the ability to change the control of the state legislature reasonably quickly. You really are only looking at 5 swing districts in the state of Washington where the margin's already pretty close, even in our current screwed up system. And some of the changes I think that are coming could make that balance of power substantially different. If you got people in there, you'd still have to run, the Republicans still have to run good candidates. They have to run serious candidates. They have to run serious campaigns. And they probably have to fire all their existing consultants and bring in people that are focused on winning races against Democrats and not just infighting each other. But assuming that you can do that, that would open you to a significant opportunity, even if you don't control the governor's office yet, because initiatives to the legislature allow the legislature to pass those as law, even without literally the governor can do nothing. There's no veto. There's no oversight. They just pass as law. So that could be a big difference. Anyway, there's a lot of things that could be moving in that direction. Amber Moore, question here: do the people have any recourse against Governor and Attorney General-elect? Do they have legal standing to rebel against the new administration and drag us all into a conflict? Well, I mean, when you say drag us all, the question is, what would the conflict with the Trump administration look like from Bob Ferguson's perspective, or the Nick Brown, who's the appointed Attorney General? And conflicts go both ways. I would anticipate, if they appoint aggressive U.S. attorneys, that the conflict from the federal side of things down to our state, so what they'd be driving are primarily corruption investigations, public integrity cases. That doesn't necessarily directly hit Bob Ferguson, but it certainly hits a lot of people on the inside who've been grifting for a long time, stealing a lot of tax dollars for whatever political influence opportunities they might have. And if those people start going to jail and getting exposed in those cases, I think you're going to see a very different sort of state as they start to go down that road. Plus, you're going to see a lot of whistleblowers and people in the know who decide that maybe it's time to come clean because something's being done about it, and I think they're going to come forward. That's usually what happens. Second thing, as I mentioned earlier, the civil rights types of cases against the state. Those, and then the third thing that the feds would do probably is things like removing the accreditation for, silly operations like the Evergreen State College, right, where they clearly, nobody should be going into debt to waste their time at that place. So as these things occur, and then withholding the funds. And so I would anticipate that withholding federal funds on dumb grant projects or theft of funds or other issues in this state, you'd probably have a fairly big change. That's something that Bob Ferguson and Nick Brown are going to play defense on. The things they want to play offense on are sort of defensive positions too, because they're saying they want to protect all of the violent sex predators and criminals that are currently here illegally. Now, if that's the hill that Bob Ferguson and Nick Brown want to die on, and the Trump administration wants to kick those people out and send them back to whatever country they came from, it seems foolish to me. But if that's his, if that's his dying wish and he wants to go down with that ship, I'm not going to stand in his way. I'm going to let him fight to defend all the violent sex predators and violent criminals that he can, who need to be basically, those people need to be rounded up and sent away. And Ferguson, if he wants to defend them and protect them, even in Washington State, there's always a bridge too far. And I'm anticipating that Ferguson's probably dumb enough to go down, at least he sounds like he is right now, to go down the bridge to that point. Jason, you got a question here. What's your thoughts on the WSP gun background check system being down for weeks? Why was there not a backup system, and how can this tech state be this incompetent? Well, you're really adding a couple of questions here, and many people, if you've known me and seen my other videos and heard me speak in public before, you know my definition of government and bureaucracy in general is essentially the best way to understand how it works is that there's a mountain of corruption and it's concealed by an ocean of incompetence. And that is government today. That's exactly how government works. It doesn't matter if you're at the city, the state, or the federal level. A mountain of corruption concealed by an ocean of incompetence. It should be the definition. I'd put it in the Webster's Dictionary. That's how I define government today. And I've never been disappointed because that's pretty much how it operates at all times. And so the question about incompetence, it is impossible, I think, for you to exaggerate the level of incompetence that exists when it comes to almost any tech project that's launched that's run by the government. They're all incompetent. There's rarely a backup system of any kind that works, and failure is certain from the day that they signed their initial RFQ to go get a quote for whatever dream and scheme that they've created. Failure is certain every time. Now, they can sometimes muddle through and eventually hire the third or fourth go-around. They find a vendor that's not corrupt or kicking back too much money to the inside political players. And they finally get around to the point where they have to do something. But incompetence is going to be where it always goes. My question is, why hasn't it failed more often? And why hasn't it failed for a longer period of time before now? But we'll have to see. Now, interestingly enough, this is an opportunity because, again, new U.S. attorneys coming in. And again, based on the profile of who it looks like they're trying to bring in here, these are people who actually, unique to this office, may be coming in with some knowledge about what the federal Constitution is and how to protect freedoms and liberties and the civil rights cases that would apply to Second Amendment cases like this. So this could be like a gift handed to them on a silver platter to go after the Bob Ferguson case, and then we see where it goes. So let's go down. Andrea K. Isn't it ironic that Insley announced a big budget deficit right before Bob Ferguson takes over in the next lead session in January? They'll use that excuse to raise taxes left and right. Well, Andrea, they already did raise taxes, and one of the problems that they're going to run into is that the truth is the world doesn't contain enough money to pay off all the insiders who want to get their piece of the pie. The other thing I think they're going to run into is I think he's understating what the budget deficit is. Now, the big budget deficit that he referenced is still something that I believe at the size it's at now is still covered by the rainy day fund. So they don't have to raise taxes now, but they may be in a situation to keep all the grifters happy that they're going to have to raise taxes in the near future. If you went through the legislative sessions, I want to say this was back in 2008 and 9, somewhere in that time frame, right after the real estate market kind of came to a crashing disaster. One of the things that did is it had a big ripple effect into state government, and there were genuine layoffs and downsizing that did occur at some levels. And so you actually saw a slight dip in the where government spent its money. I do believe that I would expect that they're going to have a little bit harder time raising taxes. Yes, the Democrats have the votes to do it. Yes, they can be pushed back on it despite the bad results that we had in this recent election, but they're also building up a reservoir of bad will against them, and you can only pay off so many people before it starts to become a problem for them politically, and we'll see how it goes. Technical difficulties, good question. Hello, with Trump talking about rounding up the illegals, do you expect to see a massive influx to the entire West Coast based off of sanctuary history? And that's a great question, and I'm kind of not expecting that, and I'll tell you why. The new Homeland Security guy seems to be, the person's going to be in charge of, what's his name, Holman, I think, who's been appointed. He's been very public. He's talking about very specifically focusing on states like Washington and others with these programs to round up particularly illegal criminals and probably drug cartel distribution crews and ID theft operations and all these other different people, human trafficking, prostitution rings, things like that. All the people that Ferguson wants to have here and defend. Now, Ferguson can defend these people all he wants, and he can say that he wants them at his home for all I care. It's sort of not going to matter. At some point in time, those people are going to get rounded up, and the worse their profile is, and assuming the Trump administration has some level of competency as they approach this program, the conflicts don't seem to be ones that they would win. And I don't know that that they're all going to, travel to a place like Washington. For one place, Washington's is not that big. It's easier to probably disappear in California, I would say. So I think you could make a pretty good argument about how you could disappear in California a little bit easier. I'm not sure that they would come to Washington, but we'll have to see. It really depends on how they roll out their deportation programs. And the difference, I think, with the Trump administration right now is that they absolutely are not, they don't seem to have any fear or unwillingness to have confrontations with hostile regimes at a local level. So particularly Illinois, which seems to be setting itself up for this, Colorado, and California and Washington. I guarantee those are like 4 of the top states that they want to come in and let the governors in these states look like the absurd clowns they are. And I think they're going to start with just busting these big criminal operations that operate under the cover and protection of a sanctuary city status. So I don't think that's going to go as well as I think they are, but we'll have to see. Do you think, Karen, this is a question here, do you think they'll be able to eliminate sanctuary city Seattle? Too much crime there. Yeah, I mean, again, just backing up to what I already said, but here's what is probably going to happen. When they're basically going into that sort of situation, the big question is, what's the legal authority of the federal government to remove funds, right? To remove federal funds coming in. So as much as Insley and Ferguson are bemoaning the fact that the state budget has a deficit due to their historic incompetence and budget wasting history, and budget blowing history. I mean, man, think about how much money they had to bribe people with to get the CCA through, and all the promises they made to all these grant grifters. And suddenly those promises are going to be broken, probably to a good percentage of them. And now the feds at the same time are going to probably step in and say or there's at least going to be a fight over whether any money is coming in from some of these agencies. My guess is that there will be a substantial drop-off of funding coming to Washington State, which further puts pressure. It's harder to hide your budget problems when those federal funds aren't coming in, and they're going to use the sanctuary status. And remember, sanctuary state status or county or state status, well, all that really means is you've said, I am not going to cooperate with the federal government. And when it comes to rounding up criminals in my community, right, and I'm going to catch sex offenders, and if they're from Venezuela or Russia or China or something, we're going to protect them because, boy, we really want these people here. Those are the people they're initially going to be busting. And Ferguson's attempt to protect them doesn't seem like that's going to go too well. Here's a question, great question. Alpha Charlie Tango, what can Ferguson do to make our lives better? Well, he can resign. That would probably be the best move that he could make. He could leave the state. He could retire. Those are the things he could do to make our life better. Perhaps what he could do is just start to do the right thing. But I just think he's institutionally incapable of doing that at this point in time. And he's really defined himself by this big fight that's going on. And with Trump, because he's obsessed with Trump, and it's a weird obsession. It's stunning to me that somebody would define themselves that way, but he has. Here's a question, Tamara. You mentioned this, and normally I wouldn't jump into this because it's a question, but I'll take the prerogative, since it is my Ask Me Anything show, but I want to talk about DSHS. DSHS is probably the single biggest point. If I was going to do a fraud investigation in Washington State and I was the federal government, I would really target a DSHS because if they're trying to find fraud, what happens is DSHS distributes most of the federal kind of welfare payments, however they're defined. The feds outsource the distribution to the DSHS, Department of Social Health and Services. I think that's the right acronym I'm using. I know what DSHS is. I just can't remember now what it stands for. Social and Health Services, I think is what that stands for now. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. But anyway, the point is that in order to qualify for federal funding and to be able to handle the distribution of that funding to your own residents at the state level, you have to create an entity that's the investigative arm for fraud. You have to demonstrate to the federal government that you're doing something to control the inevitable fraud that goes along with every government program that's ever been invented. So they have to prove they have investigators and they have a process and they'll recover the funds. The problem is there's a little bit of a disincentive for states to actually find that fraud, because when they do find fraud and they have to report it to the feds reduce the amount of money coming to that state by the amount of fraud the state found that happened at that time. So the states have no incentive to actually find fraud. They have incentive to pretend like they have an operation that finds a fraud, but they have no incentive to actually find the fraud. Washington State has a history right now, active at this point in time, I believe, that in actually trying to conceal fraud that they find through DSHS. And the reason why I know this is whistleblowers from that department came to me multiple times in the past, back when Andy Hill was still senator, actually, and was still alive, uncovering the fact that they were creating like these computer programs that and remember, they're only investigating the fraud cases that their own employees have found, and they train their employees to find fraud when they're distributing or handing out money, and they figure out this guy's stealing a bunch of money, or he's set up a child trafficking program, or he's a member of the Mexican drug cartel, or whatever it is, and then they feed that back to the fraud investigators who are specialized and skilled and trained to do this work. They look into it, and so there's a high rate of those fraud referrals that are pretty accurate. And the problem was they being the state of Washington, DSHS wasn't hiring enough people to fulfill the holes that were happening. There were investigators retiring or leaving, and they literally took an investigative agency that should have had, for lack of a more specific term, but something like 40 investigators. Instead, they were down to 6. So they clearly didn't have enough people. And so it made the papers that they had this escalating caseload they weren't getting to, which is a problem. So when they hired a new person to come in there, their idea of solving it was to make a computer program that would automatically take these likely fraud investigations, stick it in their lap, and then cancel them out after 30 days saying, well, we didn't get to it, so there must be no fraud. That's a problem, and even the federal government would normally think that's a problem. They absolutely will consider that a problem right now, and the big question is how much fraud DSHS is covering up. If I was the DSHS secretary, I'd be leaving too, because she is absolutely guaranteed to have a major investigation going on in that department. There's no way they won't, and the Trump administration would be a clown show of really goofy people that didn't look there first. It's the easiest place. I mean, this is not hard to dig in there and start to find how much fraud is going on, and we know there's a lot of fraud. So we'll just have to see what happens. Let's see. I'm trying to get the question. And again, too rich to Mr. Until we walk back into a polling booth, kiss Washington State goodbye. Well, I'm going to tell you right now that that's probably one of the federal reforms that you're likely to see right now. I have a video coming out on it another day or so, but there's essentially 6 election reforms that the feds seem to be looking at doing. They supposedly have the votes in the Senate and the House for this, and obviously the Trump administration has a motivation to push it through. Every 30 years, the federal government gets involved in elections to one degree or another. It's happened going back for a long, long time. This seems to be the time they're going to look at it again. There's 6 reforms that I can identify that it looks like they'll probably do. Number 1 is make the election day a federal holiday. That's probably the least controversial, but clearly it's to make it so it's easier to vote, so that people don't have excuses not to vote, to make it so that on that day you go and you vote, and you aren't at work, you're able to go in and vote. That's number 1. Number 2, or at least the lion's share of them be able to. Number 2 is to make it so there's no mail-in voting anymore, to make that illegal. Number 3, and then obviously that means you'd have polling stations you're going to have to go in. Number 3, voting with ID or proof of citizenship. And number 4, renewal of voter registration every few years. Make sure your signature hasn't changed, make sure you still live where you say you do, and to make sure you're still you, that you haven't died and you haven't left the state, etc. The next other reform, what they were talking about doing was eliminating the machines, having that paper trail. When I say the machines, there's some states that is electronic machine voting, and so you're never really sure that the way you voted is actually what was counted, because they don't give you any proof that that's what happens, and they're impossible essentially to audit. In Washington State, that actually doesn't apply here too much, other than the weird little omni ballot program that King County and Spokane was starting to implement, and I think the toilet paper voting sort of option, which I don't know that's ever been used, but it's the legislature in its infinite wisdom decided to add that as a feature to our voting. And then the UCAVA abuse, where they're basically having people who are not military and they're not dependents of military, but they abuse the UCAVA voting system to pretend like that's the type of voter that they are. I know these people don't exist because I've doorbelled their houses along with a number of other teams of people that have been out there. And the excuse that Mary Hall in Thurston County and other corrupt auditors around the state use when you give them a list of people and you say, I've been to these houses, nobody's lived there in 10 years. They say, oh, it's a UCAVA voter, so it's military. No, it isn't. Most of the UCAVA voters are not military. There's a big cleanup that occurs when you do this, so we'll have to see what happens. I blame Abel. You should do a collaboration with Washington State. Yeah, Washington gun law. I know I would. I should. I love what he's doing over there. It'd be fun to do it with him, actually. Let's see. Darren Minkiewicz, it sounds like nothing's going to be done with the Supreme Court in January on the magazine ban, and still sounds like we're stuck with the very unconstitutional HB 1240. It makes me sick. I just don't know how long this stuff's going to last, just for a variety of other reasons. So let's get into this. T.Z. Burton, Jim Walsh recently said the D's only picked up 1 seat, stopping a supermajority. I see this as a failure since we're in the minority and we need to pick up seats. Are all ballots counted yet? And TZ, let me answer the last question first. No, all ballots are not counted yet. This is Washington State. We haven't even found all the ballots yet. So the reality is the ballots aren't going to be counted for another week and a half. There'll be a last batch that they probably put through there. That being said, we're down to the dregs. So these are just the secret sauce ballots that get discovered in election workers' trunks or the Renton Highlands post office, pulled out of the shredder boxes in the Tri-Cities, or whatever other random place they've been abandoned in a ditch or a homeless camp somewhere. Wherever it is that they're pulling these last little dregs of ballots coming in right now. But there aren't that many, and there's not going to be a big change in any of the big races from my last election update that I had before. I'm not aware. There might be some local races that are particularly close, but I'm not aware of where those particular battles are right now. Any of the legislative races have pretty much been determined. The gap's big enough that you're not going to see some more. But, of course, there's problems out there, and that's something always worth bringing up. Jason Fisher, question, natural gas ballot measures already facing legal challenges. Will the Washington courts declare it to be illegal? I don't think they will. It was pretty carefully drafted, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to court. The difference is, I mean, a lot of people are basically trying to... They were prepared for legal fights on several of these cases already before they were ever drafted as initiatives. They knew that the left was going to go crazy because, they're just all corrupt, right? So they have to have whatever scheming program that they have that people don't like and clearly want to repeal. The left's going to try to push it through anyway. So we knew there'd be a legal fight on that one, and we'll just have to find out. Let's see. Sporting systems. No, Maryland's going to end all of our gun laws. Held up in the Ninth Circuit. Ninth in gameplay with the calendar. SCOTUS will drive our anti-gun laws. Supreme Court. Yeah, I believe there's a lot of things going on right now in the Supreme Court system. I trust what Sporting Systems has to say, and Washington gun law has probably done a pretty good job covering a lot of these issues. Barco, do you think Bob Ferguson will double down on lunatic leftist policy? And if so, how much would Trump cutting federal funding affect our budget? Thanks, and love your channel. Good question. And this is my general assessment with Trump, or Ferguson, I should say, because Trump just simply has to do what he says he's going to do based on the people that it sounds like he's appointed into these departments. They have to do essentially what they say they're going to do. They seem to be motivated, and it actually is probably not a bad thing that they're coming in with an axe to grind, and an axe to grind with bad people who they've suffered under it already. So I suspect that they'll probably do a higher percentage of what they say they're going to do than normal. Doesn't mean they won't be facing resistance, but I suspect that they'll be hitting that pretty hard. Bob Ferguson, weirdly enough, has defined himself as the anti-Trump, and that's his whole definition of himself. I don't even know what his policies are as governor right now, and maybe he doesn't either, because his first press conference is bringing in his mini-me, Nick Brown, as the Attorney General, and then basically talking about how they're going to fight Trump all day long. If so, Trump's going to be doing us a great favor. I hope that Ferguson spends his entire 4 years fighting Trump the entire way. I don't think that it's going to go quite as well as he thinks, and as Ferguson's obsessed with Trump and has nothing else on its agenda plate right now, that's probably a good thing. I'm not sure the challenge that the left is going to run into the state is that with less money to play and bribe and kick back to their friends, they're just going to be running out of options on what they can do generally. That's a good thing. If a U.S. attorney is appointed out here who actually wants to dig into public integrity and corruption cases, and they start genuinely doing that, and I've got a whole list of them, cases that they could start working on today if they want to. I don't necessarily, there's some things that you just have to investigate a little bit further. I don't have access to bank accounts normally, and so if you can get access to bank accounts with proper search warrants and see where the money actually did go, I think they're going to find that there's a lot to see or hide there. Certainly, it's worth looking at. It'd be worth looking at the Mexican drug cartel ties into the homeless industrial complex in Seattle and elsewhere, and organized crime's involvement in a lot of these grant grifting operations. I mean, there's an endless plethora of opportunities here to look at. And what happens is, as you're doing that, you're inevitably stepping on the toes of a bunch of political supporters who got Ferguson into office. And as those people get arrested or investigated, my guess is they're probably spending a little bit less time trying to find ways of abusing your freedom and I. So I just don't see them quite getting to the dream drama, the utopian leftist schemes that they had. if Evergreen State College gets decertified or Western gets decertified or a couple of these other colleges get decertified, odds are you're going to have a greatly reduced number of students that want to go there and destroy their future or ruin whatever logical thinking process they might have had left. And so as those schools are going to have to lay off people, even they'll get around having to lay off their bureaucrats even, as they downsize, and some of them will fold and go away. That changes things in our state too. Sometimes people will just have to go get real jobs. And I do think that changes things quite a bit. Let's see. Mark Hansen, would you consider running for governor of Washington? Nope, I won't, and I never will. I'd like to, really the only job in government I ever want, and that is that if there is a Republican governor that gets elected, it could be a Democrat, I suppose, but that's unlikely. If there's ever a Republican governor that gets elected, though, who actually wants to downsize government, I'm the hatchet man. I'm happy to go in there. I'd love to chop government down quite a bit. And that would be the job. That would be my dream job, is just going in there and chopping government down for a few years. If I could chop state government down by half, I'd be pretty happy. But there's just a lot of work that could be done. I've studied a lot of these agencies and departments, and I have a reasonably decent idea of where I would start looking and how I would go down the path. You couldn't do it all instantly, but there's a lot you can actually get done, a lot more than people realize. And if the Trump administration actually continues with what they claim they're going to be doing and goes down a path of genuine, the Department of Government efficiency, which is really not about government efficiency. It's just about downsizing is what you have to do. Just flat out elimination of mass. If they really drop $2 trillion off the federal budget, that's an impact. And that should be inspiration for a lot of states to go in and kind of do the same thing. Getting back to basics, there's a vast sum of money that's not just stolen, but it's wasted, it's poorly spent, malinvestment. There's all kinds of opportunities to really do a lot more efficient job in the state. Related to that, JMB had a question right here, which is, thanks for what you do. Is there a chance for some of our state executive races to win next time? There is if they clean up the voter rolls. So that's why I think there would be a fairly big impact there. Let's see, because related to that, I'm going to go with this. Their plan to get a D in the new 14th legislative district backfired, and what are your thoughts on that? Here's my thoughts on that. It did backfire, actually. They were kind of close on one of their races, but not for the amount of money they dumped into it, not for the amount of energy they put into it, and not for the impact that essentially had on the 5th legislative district in particular, which is Issaquah and Enumclaw area. They actually made that district conservative enough that, especially with the voter roll cleanup or election reform that could happen in our state by 2026, that you would probably see a totally different outcome in an election out there. And they made this weird effort of saying that Republican Hispanics are not real Hispanics and only Democrat Hispanics are real Hispanics. I think that's kind of backfired on them because based on just the demographics of the voting in Washington state, Hispanic voters in Washington state became more Republican here, just like they did elsewhere in the country. And the Democrats' weirdness, their decision to stick, they can't define what a girl is, what a woman is. They have no idea. They stick men in women's sports and let them beat up on the women. They prioritize that. In fact, they fetish that in some weird way. So doing that kind of stuff, it just doesn't seem like they're generating a large goodwill in the ethnic groups that they feel like they've divided all Americans into. And this strange approach, I think, is going to cost them more elections than what they already have. Let's see. Deanne Sanderson, do one of our Bob Ferguson friends want to start their campaign for governor in 2028? That's a good question. I don't know, but I wouldn't mind going back and looking at that sometime. I'm a little busy over the next couple years, but we'll have to see. I do believe in starting early and planning ahead, so you never know. Let's see. To go down here further, Jason Fisher, question. California's 6 states and Washington are going... California, 6 states, 6 other states, and Washington are going to restrict large diesel RVs. Will Washington allow for exemption for RVs? That's a good question. A lot of people aren't aware of that coming, and I think there's going to be such widespread disregarding that law. I'm not totally sure that that's going to be implemented quite the same way that they imagined. I think you're going to see just the cascade effect of things falling apart. I mean, one thing, when I say things falling apart, what I'm really referring to is that when you create a scenario, you have this utopian scheme that they want to approach, and then it's not going to happen, so failure is coming for sure. typically what they'll do is they'll go in and they'll try to tweak it, try to find fixes, try to find changes, bend over backwards, see if they can find a complicated solution instead of a simple one. And then when all else fails, they start to just disregard or not enforce the law very much for a while. I don't know where that's going to go, but I can't imagine that when you have less money that you're able to be just as abusive. So we'll see. Let's see, not incompetence, I'll just mention this. Yeah, listen, this is one of the hardest things. This isn't a question, but I like Fred's point here. Defining the difference between corruption and incompetence in government is a very challenging task. Again, the definition of government, a mountain of corruption concealed by an ocean of incompetence, and exactly where do you draw the line? When you find corruption, or what you believe is corruption in government, what's their first defense? We're just incompetent. We're not corrupt. We're just incompetent clowns. It's a very believable defense because most people in government are. So it makes it very challenging then to go in there and try to figure out, well, at what point did they just become totally corrupt or were they incompetent? Dealing with that is hard. Mullet Democrats, in hindsight, was Mullet the only candidate to beat Ferguson? No, he didn't have a chance in heck of beating Ferguson. And I actually don't. I like Mullet, so it's not. This isn't an attempt to shoot down Mullet at all. I saw him at the state cross-country track meet just last weekend, or not this last weekend, but the weekend before. Just didn't really get a chance to chat with him, but I saw him there, and I think he was supporting a friend. We have mutual friends, and I think he was there to support their kid at this meet. Maybe he had his own, I don't know, but I talked to him years ago once. I think he's probably been a little bit corrupted by government, but everybody who gets involved is over time. And Mullet would have been obviously much more rational, than Ferguson, but he's got a challenge because he's a Democrat who believes in math, and I don't believe that that's allowed anymore. I don't think the Democrats will allow anybody to hold any high office in Washington State. If they believe in math, they can define what a woman is. If they don't support total corruption. And I'm not totally sure what Mullet's position is on having boys beat up on girls in women's sports, but he's been pretty soft on those types of issues. But at least when it comes to finance and budget stuff, he's usually really good, and I would probably agree with him a lot of the time. But he's really not allowed to have a place in the Democrat Party, so I think his future is kind of going to be undermined. If you notice, Insley came out aggressively against him. Now Ferguson's come out aggressively against him. To Mullet's credit, he was willing to actually file complaints against Ferguson, which most Democrats weren't. Mullet's going to try to run for mayor of Issaquah, most likely, and more power to him. I think he'd actually be a good mayor in Issaquah, but I would predict that the Democrats go scorched earth on him and try to take him out there. And eventually there's a certain point where if you can't get elected to those local positions, you don't have a political future, especially in the Democrat Party. And they've been vicious and mean to him. Don't think they haven't been. It's kind of crazy. Going back to Maria, you're talking about the background checks again. And sure, there's probably some level of purposefulness. The longer this lasts, the easier it is going to be to go after them. It'd be very interesting to see where it goes, because I think there's a civil rights case here against Washington State, which would be kind of interesting. Deep dive, and sporting systems, this I totally agree with you. Imagine how fast the AG's office would have jumped to fix the issue if abortions were delayed by 3 weeks, or even by 3 minutes. I don't think there's any higher priority that the Democrats have than making sure that they get abortions out there as fast as they can. Killing babies is kind of the priority for the Democrats right now. So you're right. If they had delayed any of that, that would be the end of the world for them. Let's see. This is Fred. It's a good point. When they put the State Patrol in charge of background checks, they were planning delays. They weren't trying to improve the system. Probably true. Let's see. Rob Birch, how could the initiative ballots descriptions be less confusing next time? Well, you'd have to change the law. It's not the ballot title and description that's the problem. It's actually the what they call the impact statement. And that's what you were reading on the ballot. That was done in response to Iman's successful $30 car tap initiative, and they spent $5 million trying to defeat it. Still passed. They got pissed. Ferguson convinced the Democrats to, not just Ferguson, but it was the Democrats in general. They're really terrified at losing their tax grifting schemes, and they realize that when you survey the average person in Washington, they don't want those. But if they could confuse people enough and put confusing language like they did here, I can't tell you how many people came up to me after the election and said, I voted no against all those stupid tax increases. Just, I don't, vote yes, pay less. Don't, if you vote no, you pay more. And that's what happened. So there's going to be a lot of work to do to fix that. Now, to some extent, I am placing a little bit of faith, hopefully not misplaced, into the fact that the Trump administration seems highly unusually focused on doing election reform. Election reform will fix things in Washington. So we'll just have to see how it goes. Mullet Democrat. Why do you think Ferguson added Paul Harris, Tom Dent, and Mark Mullet to his transition team? I was surprised he added Republicans and Mullet, his former challenger. Listen, Ferguson has to pretend like he cares, right? If you meet him, he doesn't. If you've been around him, he doesn't. If you've seen him in stressful situations, he's just kind of a nasty guy. But he's probably recognizing that his weird Trump derangement syndrome kind of program makes him look so strange that he's recognizing that he has to still kind of accommodate the rest of the people. And he's going to pull in somebody, Paul Harris and Tom Dent, probably don't bring him much grief. And putting in Mark Mullet looks good. I guarantee he's going to ace them out of any significant decision-making process, but it looks good. So it's just kind of funny. Let's keep going. JMB, another question. I've had you ask a number of questions, but I'm going to point out people need to ask questions here. It's hard for me to get to you if you don't have a question. Why don't candidates just counter the Dems' lies in their political ads? For example, Reichert's statement that abortion ban was in line with Reichert's statements that the abortion ban was in line with Washington's Constitution. I'm actually not even sure what you're trying to say there, but one of the challenges the Republican campaign candidates have in the state is hiring really clownish, totally worthless consultants. It's almost hard to imagine you could find anybody worse. And to be fair, I think being a consultant in Washington State or political consultant's a tough job. And also, to be fair, I think this merits explaining some of the challenges of being a political consultant in the first place. So put yourself in their shoes. And you wouldn't want to be, but let's say you were. Every 4 years, that's your big payday. You get on a presidential or executive level race that has enough money that you can actually collect a fat paycheck. Every 2 years, if you're lucky, you get another little local race of some kind, congressman, legislator, handful of legislators, and that's kind of your next paycheck. And in between, it's a desert. There's not a lot going on. So if you're a political consultant in this state, you have to have those paydays, and those paydays have to carry you through the desert that exists in between. The only way to do anything else is you have to set up side hustles, and so you're really scrounging money all the time. So number one, it's not set up for any kind of consistent sort of income. So even somebody that's pure as a driven snow, honest and capable, you've picked a really weird place to have a career path because you're just not going to be getting consistent income. National level, probably very different. So then you compound it. Washington State's a tough place to be a consultant. And it is, if you're on the Republican side. It's hard to basically prevail in a state that doesn't tend to have a lot of money funding its candidates. And consultants are rarely capable or even aware that there's a volunteer activist base that's pretty good here. Excuse me. So their ability to actually work with them is zero usually. Instead, they want to fight with them most of the time. And so this puts the consultants at loggerheads frequently with people that they could use to expand a political campaign because they also can't get money back through using an extensive activist group that requires a lot of maintenance and kind of helping. So, and then when you lose, nobody wants to talk to you. It sucks to lose. They don't want winning bonuses because losing is pretty much all they know. And so what happens is all this stuff really combines. If you're a really good consultant, you're not going to be in Washington State. You're going to leave. You're going to go somewhere else. Even consultants that come here from other parts of the country, they usually do so because they can't compete in those areas where there's a lot of money and a lot of Republicans, and so they usually aren't the highest quality candidate consultants. So they come out here to get in the backwater USA. And so what happens when you're a candidate running for office, it's very rare you're going to have a candidate that has the ability to put together campaign teams and all the little nuances associated with running a political campaign, and be able to do that efficiently and somehow run that with somebody you can trust. You're going to bring in an outsider and they don't care. They'll say they care, but they won't, and they spend more time selling themselves than they do the candidate. So it makes it really hard. And so it's when you say why they don't just counter the Dems' lies in their political ads, you're presuming that there's anybody at all remotely capable in the ad production process on the consultant side of things. And frequently there is not. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. Let's see. I'm trying to get down some questions here. There are a lot of stuff. Here we go. Linda, wow. I'm assuming you meant no. I'm your biggest fan. How can we get federal help at the local level regarding we feel stolen election and with illegals coming across Canadian border? Who can we contact? And sorry if somebody asked before. Essentially, it comes back again to the federal election reform, which would address this issue, if for no other reason than just the third policy I mentioned, which was the identification and U.S. citizenship verification for voter registration, which has to be renewed periodically, which is the other policy reform. That would actually change. I think you'd see about my guess would be about 250 to 300,000 minimum drop off the voter rolls. I don't know how many of them are actually voting because this is all information that's secret sauce, and every time I try to find it, I usually get threatened in some significant way. So as we go through that and we're trying to figure out what's actually going on in our election system here, my guess is that would fix a lot of it. Federal help on our elections, Washington State's probably not really the highest one either, but they're looking at the reforms that they're talking about doing. Sure, they'd affect us significantly. They'd also affect Oregon, California, Colorado. You would also see a pretty big impact in Nevada and Arizona. I think, though, there's other states that you see impact in as well, Illinois for sure, and some of these other states that have really questionable structure in how they do their voter rolls. It's kind of a big deal. And let's see, TZ Burton, has there been any Republican-sponsored bills passed in Olympia? There has been at times. They're usually not important ones. A Democrat has sponsored a bill to make homelessness a human right. Well, I don't know what the homelessness, like the ability to be homeless or whatever. I'm not sure what you're referring to in that, making it homeless right. But send that. I would like to see that reference because that's kind of an interesting thing. JMB, question, the 14th Legislative District backfires. Delicious. What are your thoughts? Thanks for all you do. Well, I think I expressed them earlier, but yeah, it was a fiasco. All the millions of dollars they spent and years of planning to have it not work. And in fact, probably backfire even more than just not working in this one case. It's probably going to eventually drive Republican success in a couple of the districts. And that's despite the Republican self-destruction that sometimes goes on. As I've mentioned, I'm not a fan of how the House Republican Organizing Committee squandered their money this last time. In fact, it's almost impossible to have probably done a worse job than what they did. And especially when you look at the second legislative district and the waste of money that they put into that race and the unusual effort that they put into attacking the winner, the Republican who won that race, Matt Marshall. If the Republican consultants spent, let's say, 1/10 that energy, just a tenth of it, and focus on trying to win one of the seats that they lost, like the 26th, for example, then you would have another Republican in there instead of one less Republican. But that requires a group of people that want to win and not a group of people that want to lose. So that's hard. Then Brandon Hopper, what are the best recommendations you would give DOGE to look into in the corruption in our state? Well, remember, these guys are looking at the federal level. And so indirectly it affects our state, but the stuff that they look at the federal level, generally I would say Washington State's a good place not to send any federal funds. In general, there's probably a couple transportation projects that have merit that are using federal funding. I think the expansion of I-90 that they're doing, that long-term project, I think that's a good one. I'm glad to see that they've been doing some of the expansion work on South I-5, JBLM kind of area. I think that's a good project. There's a few others. I would definitely cut off Sound Transit. That's just a pit of money that nothing is going to come from that's of any value. It's just, that is such a grifting kickback scheme. It's hard to actually imagine. That would have been considered a joke years ago if you said this is what you're going to do. You're going to spend $1.5 billion or $2 billion a mile or whatever it's up to now. You're going to deliver 20% of what you promised 10 years late and serve 1% of the population at best. And just unbelievable. The transit-oriented development schemes that they organize, the kickback operations they have, they're just unbelievable, really. Let's go down and see. Got a question down here. Saudade 2100. The state mandated language attached to ballot initiative designed to torpedo the initiative. Will we need a ballot initiative to remove or reform that language? You could. That would be interesting. You could. But again, remember the things about ballots. So even with Let's Go Washington, Brian Haywood funding that and organizing the funding for that, even there, that's as efficient as it is on how they can get those things on the ballot. You're basically having to get down the weeds to correct dumb stuff that the legislature did. And that you're right. This is the issue. This would open the door to go forward if you could fix it. And it's probably one of the reforms you'd have to have before you could look at any kind of tax reduction initiative reform, which poll very well. But if you're going to put language that's purposely created to confuse the voter, then your polling doesn't really matter, right? Nobody knows what they're voting on or how they're voting for it. So, and that's a problem. So you could do that via initiative. That's possible. And there's no, when it's a reform through an initiative that doesn't directly affect taxes, in theory, they can't put those kind of confusing languages in there. But we'll see. Insley defined himself by only climate change. Ferguson will do the same thing using Trump. Both are one-trick ponies. Well, that's a good point, Steve. That probably is true. We will see what happens. Jason, what's your thoughts on Dem trying to declare homelessness a human right? I think it's silly, but let's go see what happens, right? So, but we'll see. JMB, in that case, you should go work for the Doge. Yes, probably so. I'm sure people have put my name in the hat there. The thing is, I'm not as focused on federal issues. I am focused on state issues. I could look at the federal issues, and there's certainly a bunch of agencies that could be eliminated from the beginning. I'll give you a couple of examples. Obviously, the Department of Education could go away tomorrow and nobody would really notice or care. They educate nobody. The money's all wasted. They primarily are just a long-term employment program for a bunch of bureaucrats back in D.C. and a couple of other places. The pass-through monies that come to the Department of Education that go to public schools in our state represents roughly about 8 to 9% of the budget of the average school district. It might be a little bit higher, a little lower, but that money is primarily diverted into two pots of funds. One is the school lunch program and the free and reduced school lunch program, and the other one is they go into special education. So the special education dollars, I set that aside because there's a little bit more of a complex model that you have to look at on how to address special education, because special education children that need specialized sorts of education, either through handicaps or other types of challenges they might face in some way, are almost always served in the public school system. But let's look at this big, bloated, free and reduced lunch program. If it disappeared tomorrow, nobody will care and notice, and that's just the truth. It's mostly a kickback scheme for Department of Ag on farmers, in theory, because they're supposed to buy some of the stuff from farmers. But there's a long-term, the whole thing's just become this boondoggle that exists mostly to perpetuate itself, not because it's genuinely needed. If school districts really think it's needed, then they can fund it themselves. I don't think it's too much of a burden for them to do that. Is it the optimal use of funding in a school district? And the answer is no. So, however, and I'll give you a story just when I was in the school board, one of the silly and crazy things about this. It turns out when I was in the Rochester School District that we charged, and I was in the school board, we were told by the feds that we charged our families too little, and when you paid for a lunch, we were charging them too little. So I don't remember what the exact amount is, but it would be like the feds said that we had to charge $3 for lunch, and we were charging $1.05 or something like that. It was some nominal amount, $1.25. It was some small amount. Anyway, They came to us and they said, we're not going to give you our money, or you're at risk of losing your money for the free and reduced lunch program in our district, which is about $250,000 or something like that. It was a fairly large amount of money coming to a small rural school district that was poor, and we had 56% free and reduced lunch in our district. And they said, you're charging too much. Well, we actually made money at the low level we were charging it at, and we didn't need to charge our community any more than what we were charging. And so if we were losing money, we would have raised it a little bit just so it broke even, but we were doing fine. And the feds came in and said they were going to do it. I was like, well, what's going to happen if we don't, if we decide we want to keep it? And then they said, we're going to take all our money away. And I said, well, do we have to jump it up to $3 right away? And they said, no, you just need to show movement towards the target price that they want you to charge, inflated target price they want you to charge the families in your district. So I said, well, then we'll just raise it a penny. We'll raise it a penny a year, and in 300 years, we'll catch up to the goal that you're giving to us right now of where you want the lunch level. Well, the feds came back and they said a penny a year is not adequate movement. And so you need to raise it a nickel a year. And so that's literally what we did. We agreed that we'd raise it a nickel a year. So in 40 years, give or take, maybe we'll get close to the targeted goal that you have at that time. It was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was crazy. It was delusional. The whole program is a pile of junk. It's just getting rid of that's no big loss. But of course, school districts will scream bloody murder because some source of funding is going to go away. And the first thing they cut is like high cap programs, and they really try to inflict the maximum amount of misery on the parents that have their kids involved in school, in the hopes that it motivates those parents to go out and help them pass a levy or something. That's usually what it is. Nowadays, it's changed a little bit recently, and I think that the Chris Reichel has really done the state a favor, who's head of OSPI. He's done more to destroy confidence in the public school system than anybody else in the history of the state of Washington. In fact, nobody in the history of the state of Washington has ever generated more students attending private school or going to homeschool. 47,000 families or so pulled them out. Not all for ideological reasons, mostly just through the collapse of the system, especially as they destroy high cap, drove a lot of more wealthy families, especially in the Bellevue area, to kind of the Bellevue, Seattle area, to pull their kids out of the school system because they actually want their kids to learn, shockingly, and they'll never learn in the school system. So they pulled them out. So that's something just to keep in mind, and that's an example. The Department of Education goes away. Who cares? If they decertify some of the colleges in America, great, or in Washington State, that's great. Evergreen should be decertified first, but there's some others that really just don't need to be certified anymore. It doesn't mean they go away entirely. If they can convince families to pay their inflated and completely bloated and beyond all reasonable cost levels, that if you're that wealthy and you want to send your kid there and pay $60,000 a year, then you go right ahead. But the federal government shouldn't be on the hook to cover the student loans for it. I like that idea of decertifying it and not having that kind of cost imposed on us. Looking at the habitat restoration programs that are around our state, the Fed should probably pull out of most of those. There's been an argument that I made years ago that some of the duplicative agencies exist at the federal and the state level, that if a state already has an agency that essentially does that task, the Fed should just stop doing it, right? They should shut down that agency. The Department of Interior has divisions like Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Forest Service, et cetera, that especially this affects mostly western states, but if they went away, and you transferred the federal assets to the state with stipulations that on how the land would be used, you don't even need the federal agency. Now, in our state, the state agencies are pretty incompetent too, but it's still easier to reform and fix incompetence at a state level. If the federal incompetence goes away, they can't stop you. And then they avoid this problem where one side blames the other. Same with Department of Ecology and EPA. Some of these things you could really do quite a bit of difference. And that's what if I was looking at Department of Government Efficiency, I would start to just find agencies that could just go away entirely and definitely get rid of this grant operation. And I like the idea of downsizing. If you got rid of about 80% of the employees, most particularly everybody in upper management, it'd be fine. the salty infidel. Is the Second Amendment dead in Washington as soon as Ferguson takes over the throne? And if so, what can we do to try to save it? Does anybody actually think that Insley is any more in favor of supporting our gun rights than Ferguson? And the answer to that, I hope, is no, because they're both equally bad on this issue. Ferguson's taken more of a point on it for kickback and billionaire funding programs for his campaign. But generally, my guess is that you're not going to see a lot of changes in this area. What could happen is, because of the federal focus that I think is coming on correcting a couple of these issues, that's probably the biggest ripple effect that goes into that changes things in our state. Or if the election reform comes through, which does appear to be the single highest priority or one of the single highest priority. I would say it's probably priority number 2, because it appears the first priority is getting rid of all the violent sex predators and the illegal aliens that are criminals in our state first. And Bob Ferguson wants to keep them here, and he wants them for voting, I guess. But that'll be an interesting reason for him to stand in the schoolhouse, doorway, telling the federal government to stop. I want to keep these violent sex predators here, but we'll just see how it goes. Ooh, this is interesting. So you're suffering I'm in a commercial building right now, so I don't hear the wind or anything. I do have to drive in this later on today, so that should be interesting. Anyway, we'll see. Chris M., why would Trump do anything to fix Washington? Hard times create men, strong men create easy times, and easy times create weak men. That's true, but right now you have Washington in D.C., or Trump, I should say, in D.C., and I think you completely underestimate, Chris, how pissed off Trump is personally at Ferguson. And it's not about Washington. It's about Ferguson's idiocy and even attracting more attention and being the guy out there that Trump's going to enjoy taking down a notch or two. So the other thing to remember is that some of the reforms I'm talking about, particularly election reform, Washington's just one of a bunch of places that get affected by it. We're not the only ones impacted by it. It's not about us. It's about a bunch of people. It's about a third of the country that gets significantly impacted in a major way. I really believe the election reform they're talking about is going to affect Republican states as well, because I think there's a lot of problems in just being involved in voter roll cleanup all around the country. But there's a lot more going on. Let's see. Let's keep working down here. I got some other questions out here, and let's see. I suggest all listening submit a personal request to President Trump to investigate the Washington politicians that are responsible for violation of citizens' Second Amendment rights. Your guidance, please. Yeah, Ken, I totally agree. I think that's a good idea. Send it to every single person you can find who's remotely associated with the Trump transition teams who've been recently elected to Congress. You do have Baumgartner in Spokane. Give him something to do when he gets back there. I think these are all good ideas, and we should. And you're going to have some new U.S. attorneys in Spokane and Seattle. Let's give them something to work on. Let's see. And going on with Elvis here, are we stuck with Bob 3 or 4 terms? Inslee never had a credible primary challenger. And the answer to that is no, you aren't. You aren't stuck with him. And you really aren't stuck with him if they do reform the election laws. And if the feds actually step in and do reform election laws, it won't be just Washington, but you're going to see big changes. I would actually predict substantial changes in certain regions, in particular in Washington, Oregon, and California, but also in Colorado and Arizona. I think you just see some big changes, so we'll see how it goes. Let's see. Jumping in here, Karen Grice. I've been shocked by judges who allow low bail and short sentences for violent criminals. Do you think we will ever see improvement in the judges that we have in the state? Too much serious crime. You're right, and I think if we do get election reform out here, we need to immediately be recruiting capable and good people to go in and actually run for judges. In our state, we do elect them, and I think that's just we got to emphasize that. It's really important. Let's see. Okay, so how should someone go about fighting nepotism? I worked for an office I believe kept my complaints from Washington WSHRC and the auditor's office, leaving lives and well-being in the wake. Lawyers are scared. Good question. I mean, nepotism, I'm assuming, is you're familiar with somebody hiring family members or something like it. It goes on all the time, Department of Ecology and some of these other agencies. And it's hard to fight if you're aware of it, because sometimes there's people that don't have the same last names, but they actually are related and they all hired each other. And I mean, it's an old story, right? It goes on all the time. Supposedly they have laws against it, but they really don't. They don't really. First, you have to argue about it. You have to present it. You know, they're only going to go after you if you're a Republican and you do that. So anyway, that's quite an issue. Let's see. PH Joy, I would love to not just verify I voted, but be able to see if who I voted for got marked correctly. I would too. And that's a great question. I mean, there's a way to do that, but that's a longer conversation. I do not believe that would be part of formal federal election overhaul. It could be something that you could implement how to do it here locally. Anyway, let's see. PH Joy, plenty of trolls here, Glenn, but I wish I knew how to handle my dad. But there's so much, and where do I start? He votes and protests for write-ins. Last term, it was Ben Sass. Yeah, I mean, listen, people are going to do that. I don't mind you doing that if there's just one Democrat or a judge or something that nobody's running against, and you want to do it just to show that they aren't going to be there. But I don't find... the write-in process, when you have a competitive race and you can pick at least the least worst of two people, I don't find the write-in to be a powerful thing. JMB, and I know I have pulled up a number of your questions here, but they're pretty good ones, so thank you for asking some of them. Obviously, you're tied into some of these issues, but will anyone at HROC, which is the House Republican Organizing Committee PAC, be held accountable for their dumb decisions? And the answer is no. Being dumb and making dumb decisions seems to be a primary requirement to work at HROC and to be in charge of it. Big problem with HROC is that their higher priority is reducing the quality. Appears to be anyway. It's just keeping like a country club group of people together that like each other and not about winning more seats. It's easier to have a smaller club that you can all be friends with than expanding the club and get some people in that may be independent thinkers. That, I mean, at its basis, that's a problem. They've never admit that, but that just their behavior has shown. This year was the worst. Just some of the craziest stuff. The way they spend their money is incompetent, and every vendor they use should probably just be banned for future reference. I would never use any of those vendors again. I just can't believe that how bad that is. But I don't know. It kind of depends. They do have a reorganizing committee coming up in the legislature, and the Republicans will be determining who their leadership's going to be. And part of that sort of dictates how HROC is managed. It's almost impossible to manage it worse. So if they could make any reforms in that direction to improve it, that'd be good. One of the challenges that's been brought up with HROC is the question of safe seat Republicans transferring their funds in and then controlling where the money goes. And it's a pay-to-play scheme in the sense that if you don't donate some of your surplus funds into HROC, they don't want to listen to you with how the money needs to be spent. So the challenge becomes that if you're in a contentious seat, you hold on to your money because you need your money for future battles. And if you're in a safe seat where it's 70% Republican, like a lot of Eastern Washington seats are, they get to just get a bunch of lobby cash, build it up, and then transfer that money into HROC, which they're legally allowed to do since it's an affiliated, and it's a longer conversation to get into Public Disclosure Commission rules, which I don't mind doing, but it doesn't seem like we're going to have the time to do that today, and nor is it a good use of time. Nevertheless, this has created the decision-making process for how HROC spends its money is egregiously incompetent and short-sighted in most cases. So they need very different people running it. And they can't be hiring the same consultants because even when they do spend the money well, in the sense they've at least spent it in a place that makes sense, it's spent very poorly. Let's see, what's your thoughts on HB 1333, the Domestic Violent Extremism Task Force that didn't pass the AG? Will he sneak it into the 2024 budget? Well, he can't sneak it into the budget anyway. I think that bill's kind of dead, to be honest with you. I don't think it's coming anywhere. He's got more attention than he ever wanted it, so we'll just have to see. Let's see. Let's go. The middle ones. As an Eastern Washington Democrat, I love that I found this channel. It's good to hear the other side when it comes to the small government side. Well, thank you. I hope there's more people out there that might have a D next to their name that care about small government. might want a little smaller one themselves, or at least one that's a little less abusive. I am going to start, I think I'm going to call it here, guys, because I do have some more questions here. Good questions tonight. They're spread all over the place, and I didn't get to a lot of them at the end, but I do hope to be working on some of these issues more as we go ahead. Watch for my next 2 videos that are coming up. I do think the one on election reform will be most beneficial for those of you who are asking questions tonight related to impact on elections in our state. Watch for my Evergreen State College one, just because some people might be interested on the impact in higher education, at least as a case study example of how the Trump administration might be able to make an impact in that area. It's not exactly shutting it down, which is the title of it, but it would just be how Trump would move in that direction, at least based on what they've already said, and then how it would really work. With that, just let me know what other topics you want me to cover moving forward. I've got plenty of topics to cover, no shortage, just not enough time to produce the videos. But I will try to do more of that as time goes by. If you're out in Spokane, I might see you Thursday night. If you go to the Citizens Alliance Property Rights event, I'll be speaking there. And otherwise, thank you guys so much for all your questions, sharing. And I can see looks like there were about 2,100 people who logged on to the live stream tonight. So thanks for all your comments and involvement in this live stream. Sometimes I'm amazed that you guys stick it out and that I have anything interesting enough to say that keeps that many of you wanting to continue to ask questions. But we'll see you next week. I plan on doing it the same time, same day next week. We'll see if the power goes out. If you lose power tonight, just be safe out there, be prepared, and we'll see you next time. Thank you guys so much.